Every noble heir and ambitious warlord in the 11th century shared the exact same intoxicating dream. You stand on a jagged limestone ridge, overlooking a fertile valley, watching stone upon stone rise into the sky. You see a towering keep, thick curtain walls, arrow slits, and a grand hall fit for banquets. You see an impenetrable fortress of pure authority. You imagine sitting in your solar, collecting rents from cowed peasants, drinking spiced wine, and resting easy, knowing that no rival lord or band of marauding mercenaries can touch you. You calculate the raw power of having 50 men-at-arms stationed behind 10 feet of solid masonry. It looks like the ultimate feudal flex. A machine that converts stone and labor into absolute local dominance and generational security. It wasn't. Owning a medieval castle was not a romantic symbol of ultimate security. It was a bottomless financial abyss, a brutal cash flow trap, and an operational nightmare disguised as a military fortification. The economics were so ruinous that a single decade of peace could bankrupt a baron just as quickly as a 6-month siege. Castles were not passive income assets. They were aggressive capital sinks that forced their owners into endless cycles of extortion, predatory taxation, and high-yield debt just to keep the mortar from crumbling and the garrison from revolting. To understand how a castle hollows out your balance sheet, you first have to construct the asset. And in the Middle Ages, building a stone castle was the equivalent of a small nation financing a modern nuclear aircraft carrier. You didn't just hire a local carpenter. You imported an entire industrial ecosystem of master masons, stonecutters, lime burners, carpenters, blacksmiths, and hundreds of unskilled laborers who had to be fed, housed, and paid in cash or grain for years on end. In the early Norman period, a simple wooden motte and bailey castle might cost 50 to 100 pounds silver, a manageable sum for a favored knight receiving land after a conquest. But if you wanted to survive the arms race of the High Middle Ages, if you wanted a concentric stone fortress with round towers, portcullises, and a massive gatehouse, the capital costs exploded into realm-shattering figures. Take King Edward I's Ring of Iron in Wales during the late 13th century. Caernarfon Castle cost roughly £22,000 silver. Conwy Castle ran around £15,000. To put those numbers into perspective, the total annual revenue of the English crown at the time was only around £30,000 to £40,000. A single elite castle consumed over half the kingdom's entire annual budget. Even for a wealthy baron, building a modest, lordly seat with 4 corner towers and a curtain wall, the bill routinely exceeded £2,000 to £5,000. In an era where a common knight earned about £20 a year and an agricultural laborer made 2 pence a day, building a stone fortress required mortgaging your family's future for generations. If you lacked the immediate cash reserves, you turned to medieval high finance, Jewish or Lombard moneylenders, or wealthy monastic orders like the Knights Templar. These loans carried interest rates ranging from 15 to 40%. Because charging interest was officially condemned as usury by the church, financiers masked the fees through currency conversion tricks, artificial exchange rates, or by taking temporary control of your most productive manors as collateral. If you missed a payment, the lender took the agricultural yields of your best land, stripping away the very revenue you needed to service the rest of your debt. Once the final stone was laid and the lime wash dried, you stepped into the operational meat grinder. The core economic model of a castle depended on feudal agricultural extraction. You owned the surrounding manors, and the peasant serfs owed you labor, crops, and fees. They brought their grain to your manorial mill, paid a fee to bake their bread in your oven, and rendered a third or more of their harvest in wheat, barley, and livestock. On paper, the revenue looks dependable. A self-contained economic ecosystem where the land feeds the lord. But the moment you calculate the castle's daily burn rate, the spreadsheets turn bloody. First, there was the baseline garrison cost. A castle is useless without trained bodies to defend it. In peacetime, a modest baron's castle required a minimum standing force, a castellan or constable to manage daily affairs, a dozen men-at-arms, a few dozen archers, crossbowmen, watchmen, a chaplain, blacksmiths, armorers, cooks, grooms, and stable hands, paying wages, providing uniforms, sharpening weapons, and feeding 50 to 80 full-time residents ate through tons of food and dozens of pounds of silver every month. During times of war or heightened tension, when the garrison doubled or tripled, your payroll costs skyrocketed overnight. Second, consider the insider metrics that governed your feudal balance sheet. The most brutal metric for a castle owner was not land acreage, but the feudal service ratio and commutation rates. Under the traditional feudal contract, your vassal knights owed you 40 days of knight service per year for free. But 40 days was barely enough time to march to a border, let alone sustain a defense or campaign. To keep knights in your garrison beyond 40 days, you had to pay them cash wages, known as scutage or shield money. If your local vassals preferred to pay you cash to skip their military service entirely, you had to convert those payments into hired mercenaries. Mercenary companies like the infamous Brabançons or Genoese crossbowmen demanded upfront gold and looted your own countryside if their pay fell even 3 days in arrears. Worst of all was the yield to maintenance friction. Stone structures sitting on exposed hilltops undergo relentless weathering. Frost expands in wall cracks, shattering the mortar. Timber roof beams rot under leaking lead roofs. Wooden drawbridges, hoarding scaffolds, and iron portcullis chains decay in the rain. Up to 15% of a lord's total annual income was routinely swallowed by structural maintenance, quarrying fresh stone, burning lime, and hiring specialist masons just to prevent the curtain wall from collapsing under its own weight. The physical layout of a castle was a masterclass in military defense, but an absolute disaster for operational efficiency and personal comfort. It was a cold, damp machine built entirely around physical deterrence, designed to make everyday life expensive and inconvenient. If you walked into the Great Hall or inner bailey of a stone fortress, you were standing inside a giant thermal sink. Thick stone walls absorb cold and hold moisture. Heating a medieval keep was a logistical nightmare. It required hundreds of tons of firewood every winter wood that had to be harvested from your forests, chopped, transported, and stored in dry vaults. A baron's hearth consumed entire groves of timber just to keep the main hall barely above freezing, depleting forestry resources that could have been sold to local towns or used for lucrative building projects. Lighting was another massive hidden liability. Torches created blinding smoke that blackened walls and ruined tapestries. Clean lighting required tallow candles made from animal fat, which smelled awful and spoiled, or expensive beeswax candles imported from monastic apiaries. The cost of illuminating a large stone castle for winter feasts and nightly watch routines rivaled the wages of the lower garrison staff. Furthermore, the design of a castle was a spatial trap for economic logistics. Because castles were built on steep, craggy heights, rocky islands, or behind wide moats for defensive superiority, getting heavy supplies into the inner bailey was an expensive chore. Every sack of grain, barrel of salted beef, stack of firewood, and cask of wine had to be hauled up narrow, winding tracks or carted across drawbridges. This created supply bottlenecks. You had to hire extra carters, maintain pack horses, and pay for constant wear and tear on wagons. The very geography that kept your enemies out made feeding yourself twice as expensive. If the routine operational costs didn't drain your treasury dry, the structural volatility and military reality of the feudal system stood ready to execute your balance sheet. A castle owner operated in an environment where political instability, royal jealousy, and siege warfare could instantly destroy generations of accumulated wealth. The primary financial threat was over-leveraging during an arms race. As military technology evolved, moving from simple catapults to massive weight-counterpoised trebuchets, castle owners were forced to continuously upgrade their defenses. A simple square keep built in 1150 was a death trap by 1250. You had to round off your square towers so trebuchet stones would glance off, build concentric outer walls, construct elaborate barbicans, and dig deeper moats. Lords who failed to reinvest their agricultural profits into defensive upgrades found their castles obsolete, while those who borrowed heavily to finance upgrades often went bankrupt before the masonry was finished. If an actual siege occurred, the financial devastation was total. A siege was not just a battle, it was economic scorched earth. To prepare for a siege, you had to burn your own surrounding villages and crops so the enemy couldn't use them for food or shelter. You voluntarily destroyed your own tax base. Inside the castle, you consumed your multi-year grain reserves while earning zero fresh income from your fields. Outside, the besieging army dug sap trenches beneath your walls, smashed your gatehouses, and slaughtered your livestock. Even if you successfully repelled the enemy, you were left sitting in a battered, ruined fortress, surrounded by burned manors, dead serfs, and zero revenue for years to come. Victory felt almost indistinguishable from financial ruin. Then came the legal and political risk known as adulterine castles and the royal right of seizure. In times of weak royal authority, lords built unlicensed castles known as adulterine castles to grab local power. But when a strong king reclaimed the throne, he would issue orders to slight meaning, completely demolish unlicensed fortresses, or force the owner to hand over the keys under the principle of renderability. You could spend thousands of pounds building a stronghold, only for the crown to legally confiscate it, or order your own workers to knock down the walls you just spent 20 years paying for. Case Study 1. The Financial Collapse of the Bigod Earls of Norfolk. In the late 13th century, Roger Bigod, 5th Earl of Norfolk, undertook a massive, luxurious rebuilding of Framlingham and Pembroke castles, alongside lavish expansions at Tintern Abbey. He poured staggering sums into high-status stone architecture to assert his feudal independence against King Edward I. To finance these vanity projects and maintain a sprawling aristocratic lifestyle, Bigod ran up massive debts with Italian banking houses and the crown. By the late 1290s, Bigod was completely insolvent. He could no longer service his debts or maintain his garrison costs. Forced into a corner, he was compelled to make a humiliating deal with King Edward I. In exchange for the relief of his debts and a modest annual income, Bigod agreed to surrender his vast lands and castles to the crown upon his death, disinheriting his own family. Capital structure failure, combined with political overreach, stripped his bloodline of their ancestral seat forever. Case Study 2. The Siege and Ruin of Rochester Castle in 1215. Rochester Castle possessed one of the tallest and most formidable stone keeps in England. During the First Barons' War, a group of rebel barons seized the castle to stand against King John. King John responded by laying a brutal, relentless siege. He brought in 5 massive siege engines, cut off all supply lines, and eventually hired miners to dig a tunnel directly underneath the massive southeastern tower of the keep. To collapse the tunnel, John ordered his men to burn the wooden support props using the fat of 40 fat pigs. The resulting inferno collapsed the entire corner of the stone keep. The siege cost King John thousands of pounds in soldier wages and engineering supplies, while the rebel barons inside lost everything. The castle was shattered, the surrounding estate was devastated, and the repairs took decades of crown tax revenue to rebuild. The castle functioned as designed by holding out for weeks, but the physical and economic asset was utterly demolished in the process. When you strip away the romantic myths of chivalry, heraldry, and royal banquets, the medieval castle was not a romantic sanctuary. It was a massive, capital-hungry weapon of feudal coercion that demanded a constant diet of silver, wood, and human labor just to stand upright. The true mathematical reality of owning a medieval castle comes down to one fundamental equation. Net feudal profit equals manorial agricultural surplus plus feudal court fines minus standing garrison payroll plus structural maintenance plus debt servicing plus thermal divided by logistical overhead. If your agricultural yields dropped due to a bad harvest or plague, but your garrison still demanded their daily silver, and your stone walls needed lime repointing, your balance sheet collapsed into negative territory instantly. On average, A well-managed castle attached to productive, peaceful manors yielded a long-term realistic net return of just 3% to 8% annually on the total capital. Invested a dismal return for an asset that carried a constant risk of military destruction, legal confiscation, or debt foreclosures. The only entity that made castles pay off over generations was the centralized monarchical state. Kings and sovereign republics could afford castles because they didn't rely on the agricultural surplus of a few local manors. They used kingdom-wide taxation, national customs duties, and large-scale debasement of the coinage to subsidize their defensive networks. They treated castles not as standalone profit centers, but as strategic infrastructure loss leaders designed to enforce tax collection and project royal power over vast territories. The feudal system was never structured to let an individual baron sit back and enjoy passive wealth inside a stone fortress. The quarry owner took his cut. The master mason charged top silver. The Lombard lender collected 30% interest. The garrison demanded daily wages, and the elements slowly ground the stone back into dust. The system was rigged for the sovereign state that controlled the treasury, never for the over-leveraged lord holding a crumbling keep against the tide of history.